So the only genre that Bach didn't compose in was opera. All right, what I'd like to do next is to look at the chart on page 165. It'll be very similar to this last test where I will give you this chart to fill out, which compares characteristics of Baroque with characteristics of classical composers. And so all of these characteristics that we talked about with Bach are reflected in this chart. So one of the main things that you should keep in mind is the idea associated with the doctrine of affections, which was a basic principle and sensibility in the Baroque period, in which the idea that music elicits an emotional response. It has that power to create an emotional response in the listener, and that most importantly with this is that composers would only present one emotion per movement, which is basically the idea of not confusing the listener with conflicting emotions. So several of these characteristics have to do with this idea of one theme or one rhythm or one emotion that's continually developed in a movement. So if you look at that bottom characteristic of emotion, it says single affectation, so that's single emotion, and emotional exuberance and theatricality. So it definitely has a sense of emotional expression, but just to recap with what I mentioned about Bach, that Baroque period emotion is something that's either glorifying God, as is the case with Bach. It wasn't something that's an individual emotional expression, but instead something that represents his feelings about the glory of God through his music. Or the composer is glorifying the monarch for whom the music is written. And so that's something that's in contrast to the classical style, which has that sense of self-imposed restraint, emotional restraint. All right, under rhythm, you can see it says single rhythm predominant. So again, that has to do with this one idea, and that it's steady, energetic pulse. So that term Fortspannung is a term that describes this continual spinning out of a theme. So lots of sequential writing, but this one rhythm would be the dominant rhythm within a movement. And then some other characteristics that have to do with this idea of a single emotion. One is under timbre, and it says continuous tone color throughout one movement. So as we listened to the Bach Brandenburg Concerto, it was basically a string orchestra plus then the solo group. And you did have that alternation between the group and the soloists, but you didn't have in the Baroque period the idea of a separate wind family and brass instruments and percussion, with the timpani. And so that's something that develops in the classical era. So basically the orchestra in the Baroque era is a string orchestra. And you don't have that changing points of color. That's something that's more of a classical characteristic that will develop in the middle part of the 18th century, and a little bit before that, of course. So, a couple of more ideas here, but we'll just go down. The characteristic under melody is this idea of continuous rhythm or in melody with wide leaps, and the use of chromatic tones for emotional effect. And so the use of chromaticism is always something that is associated with an expressive element or emotional element, and so we see that in the Baroque period. The harmony also has a similar description of chromatic harmony for expressive effect, and that it's during the Baroque period that the major-minor system was established. So you should be able to talk about the beginning of the Baroque era and the term monody and what monody implies with the use of figure-based notation, single melody, so it's a type of homophonic texture, but it's that use of figure-based notation that is a basic characteristic of the Baroque era, in which that use of figure bass will be discontinued in the classical period. And so that was something then that identified chord progressions and the structural units of triads and seventh chords to create these progressions that identified a tonic key that was either major or minor. And so that whole element of tertian harmony is what arose in the Baroque period, and that is what is common among the three periods of Baroque, Classical, and Romantic during the common practice period. So under texture, it says monodic texture in the early Baroque, and then polyphonic texture in the later Baroque. And so with Bach is the greatest master of polyphony and of motivic thematic developments, and of the contrapuntal skill that we just talked about with the way that he could manipulate and develop themes. And so Bach sets the example for thematic development. And so this is something that was incorporated in the second half of the Baroque period, was this very complex counterpoint, which is something that was characteristic of the end of the Renaissance, so the High Renaissance, but instead of it being in a modal framework and being vocal, then we have the idea of tonality and having a tonal counterpoint that emerges at the end of the Baroque period. All right, all of these genres that are listed here: trio, sonata, concerto grosso, suite, prelude, fugue, chaconne, passacaglia. We'll talk about all of those. In talking about form, it lists binary and ternary forms are predominant. So binary form is the form that's associated with dance movements. And this is the form that is going to then develop into sonata allegro form. So it's the basis for sonata allegro form. And the things that are the basic ideas that then sonata allegro form continues are the use of two sections that are enclosed with double bars and repeats. So sonata allegro form will have this opening section, this becomes the exposition, and then this section would become development and recapitulation. And then the overall harmonic plan, which is tonic to dominant in the first half, or minor, tonic to relative major. And then the second half would be the reverse of that. And so this becomes the basis for sonata allegro. But this is what you see in a dance movement. And the thing that's different about a binary form dance movement in the Baroque period is that they just take one theme. So there's not a contrasting A theme and B theme, but instead it's one theme continuously developed. So that was a very important form in the Baroque. The other that's listed here in your chart on page 165 is ternary. And the basic place that you see that is in the most popular type of form that's associated with opera seria, which is a type of Italian opera, which means serious opera, that developed in the 17 teens, became really popular, and it had this type of aria that's called a da capo aria. And a composer who wrote opera seria, probably one of the most important composers, was Handel. And so Handel was writing opera seria in London from the 17 teens until the early 1730s, when he changed then, because musical style and taste was changing, and so opera seria wasn't popular anymore. And so he started writing English oratorios, and the most famous of those is his Messiah, which is his most famous work. But at any rate, the use of da capo aria was an opening A section that would then have a shorter contrasting key and contrasting material for a B section, and then at the end of the B section was a da capo, and what would happen is then the A section would be repeated, but it would be embellished when it was repeated. So there's that element of improvisation. And it was very often a virtuosic embellishment, which then is something that led to certain abuses. And there, in the middle of the 18th century was the idea of opera reform, which basically was, concerning reforming this practice of having all these da capo arias within the structure. So we'll put here embellished and virtuosic. And so that's the most important ternary form. So these are the two basic plans here that are listed. And then in the classical period, of course, sonata allegro is what emerged in the middle part of the century, and that was one of the most important developments of the classical period. All right, in terms of dynamics, you have listed here subtle dynamic nuances, forte piano contrasts. One thing that you might add to this is the term terraced dynamics, which again just has to do with these different dynamic levels that were more general that would be listed, but you didn't have the idea of crescendo and diminuendo that would connect one dynamic level to the next, but instead you just had these different planes or terraced kind of approach. And so that's something in contrast with the classical style, which does then introduce the idea of crescendo and diminuendo. All right, and then the idea of improvisation, I've already talked about that some, and so you see that in several different ways, but probably the most important are the realization of the figure bass notation by the keyboard player, which required by nature that the right hand part of the keyboard would be a voicing that's based upon the intervals that indicate the harmony that sound above that bass line. And so you have that one example. And then you also have the examples that are associated with embellishment and ornamentation, so that it was the performance practice that in a binary form movement, when the player or players, if it was an orchestral suite or whatever, that when you would take the repeat, that especially in a slow movement, that the players would embellish that repeat. And so that's something that was improvised, and so that's basic element of the Baroque style is that embellishment of a melody. And then this idea of the return of a section and embellishing the return, like in da capo aria as an example of improvisation. So that was a really important aspect of the Baroque period, and then it's something that diminishes in importance as the common practice period evolves, and that kind of went along with the idea of composers writing more and more directions into the score as the common practice period evolved. And so composers were wanting to have more control over exactly the way that their music would be presented. So the next work that we're going to look at is from the classical period, and is the first movement of the Mozart Piano Concerto in B minor, Kochel 466. And so, when I talked about Mozart and the Prague Symphony, I I just mentioned the fact that the concerto and the opera are the two genres that Mozart wrote some of his most successful works. And so, why are these works so successful? And a lot of it has to do just with the idea of music presenting, a conversation. And so, within the context of a concerto, you have the idea of the orchestra in conversation with the soloist. Mozart even adds an extra element to that in his concerti very often, which is that he would present a very important part to the woodwind section. And so that's one of the things that sets Mozart's concerti apart. There's one other aspect too, which you'll find in Mozart concerti, which is that when the soloist enters, that Mozart gives the soloist a new theme at that point. And so that's something that further delineates those personalities, those characters. So Mozart was really a genius at being able to present personal characteristics through his music, and so he was incredibly adept at being able to musically personify characters in his opera so that they took on a three-dimensional character. They were believable. The music made them seem like they were arrogant or that they were simple-minded or whatever. Mozart was a great mimic and someone who could imitate the way other people spoke or walked. And so, that's really was something which played out well in these genres of concerto and opera. So I'll put here just a couple of important characteristics often present in his concerti are the fact that the woodwinds serve as a third, we'll put here, competing force. In addition to the orchestra, and the soloist. So the winds are really important too. All right, and then the second thing is that Mozart often gave the soloist its own theme, unique from the themes that the orchestra had presented. Okay, so what we're going to see with the Mozart first movement of concerti, and just by the way, he wrote 27 piano concerti. And Mozart, compared to Haydn, was a much greater performer and virtuoso. And so Mozart wrote these works for himself to perform, and he would conduct the performance from the keyboard. So this is before you have the idea of the conductor being a separate musician. And so we'll put here, Mozart conducted from the keyboard. One thing to note is that the orchestra that Mozart used is very similar to the orchestration that you find in the symphony, maybe with fewer